This lesson is going to be the fun part because we're going to bring our database into our front end. So we've set up all of our database. So we see we've got the database up and running, set up, ran through all three setup files, and we're going to need to bring the database into our main index.js file. So let's copy and paste this up at the top. And we don't actually need this helper stuff anymore, and we don't need the database. So we're not going to be using that anymore. We're using our real database. So let's add that into our project. And we can use the same variables. We can do this one, const database as well. So basically it's linking to that test database. Wherever your location, make sure that you've linked to it properly, that you've got the right path. I've kept in the error there. I've kept in the connected to the database. You don't need this stuff, but it's always good to have that in there. So the next thing that we need to do, we don't need to change any of the middleware. So that's all fine. And the only thing that we're changing is we're changing the routes. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to update how the route is outputting content. So previously we were loading the page, we were refreshing, and we were looping through the data. So we want to do the same thing. We want to get that same type of output. So let's set up our database query. So we do DB, referring to the database object. And this one is all because we want to return back all the values. So it's select, and we want to return back all the columns as well. So we're going to select all the columns from the user. We can specify columns if we want. If we just wanted the names or the users or the IDs, we can do that as well. So our database table is users, so from users. And that's going to be our query. So that's our SQL query. And if you're familiar with SQL or MySQL, then this should be fairly straightforward to you. And we're wrapping it in a function so we can check for errors and we can return back the rows. So when we do get a response, what we want to do is we can do a check here to make sure that it hasn't thrown any errors before we try to output as well. And I needed one more rounded bracket there to close that statement off. So all we have to do is grab this and put it in here. And instead of data, we're referring to rows. So let's open up and start up. We'll do nodemon on index.js. So start up our server, refresh our server, and we get connecting to the database. So let's see what happened. Let's go into inspect. And we're not getting anything in our console. So let's see what's going on if we're actually returning information from our database and so on. Let's go to index and go over to here, and let's console log out that data so we can see what's happening, what data is actually being pulled in there, if we're seeing any errors. And when we refresh, we see that we've got all of those values. So it's being actually returned differently. So earlier, what was happening is we had multiple arrays and we had the objects within those array items. But this time, so we've got so when we go in here, we see our data is being returned differently. So it's listing them all out by objects. So we don't have that users object anymore. We just have data. So we can get rid of that. And this time when we refresh it, we see we've got all of those values that we set. And there are some other differences as well, because we did call it within the setup. We did have name and password. So let's update that. We don't have user anymore. We're just using name. And of course, we could have used user, would have been more consistent. But let's keep it at that. And we'll also call it name there as well. So small adjustment. Let's see what happened. And everything is output properly. So that was our first route. And that was relatively smooth to bring over our database data. So next, and of course, the other routes aren't hooked up yet. So even if we try to add something, save, delete, or view, that's not hooked up yet. So that's what we got to do next. So let's go back into our index.js file. And we can see how easily we can transform what we were doing earlier into the same format that we were using with the database. So this time, we don't need to create an ID because the database is taking care of that for us. So one of the benefits of using the database, we'll do db run, and let's set up our query. So this is going to be insert into, specify the table that we're inserting at, users, and the two values that we're inserting. So we're inserting name and pass. And the values that we're inserting, so just bracket those values in there, and we just comma separate out those values. And we know that we were actually getting the values from the body. So let's add those in. So let's two single quotes, and we need some doubles to break out of it. And within the body, we're passing a parameter by name. So that's the one we want to insert. And then do the double quotes to get back into our string. And the other value that we want it to do is we want to pass the password. So we have to specify for each one. So this is our SQL query. So we're inserting all of those values. And that's double single quote there. I know it's a little hard to read that. So that's our query, and then we're going to check for errors. And if we find any errors, we can do something with the errors. If we don't get any errors, we could just do a console log of errors. And if we don't see any errors, then let's return back. So do res, and we're going to return it back within a JSON because we did want to focus quite a bit more on JSON than just regular text. And you don't have to do it in JSON, but it just makes more sense. It's easier to pick up. And there's going to be a value that gets returned, which is last ID. And we can get rid of the other stuff there as well. So now we are ready to try that out. So we want to add to our database. So let's see if this works. Tester, password, click, and there we go. So we get an ID of 11, and let's check that out. So there we go. So it got deposited in, and it does look like we did have a problem there. We didn't get the name properly sent in. So let's go take a look and see what happened. So when we're sending it over to the server, we got to make sure that those values are proper. So we've got request body name and password. So let's go take a look at our index, see what happened. And I have to update this one. So this one is still going under user. So let's update that to name. So refresh, and this time, hopefully it should work. And of course, once we update our save route, then we can update that one as well. Tester, new password, and click. So let's see if that created that properly. So there we go. It looks like it worked. ID of 12 was assigned from the database, tester new. So that was one little quirk there, but we did change the name to user. So that was something that we could have done differently so that we wouldn't have to make these updates as well. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to set up this view. So right now when we click view, it's not working. It's not working properly. So I want to set up that view. And of course it's not working because we're not requesting anything from the database. So let's set this one up. So this one is going to be similar, where we're going to select from the database. We can get rid of all of that because we don't need to make use of it at all. So select from users, and again, if you're familiar with SQL, this should make a whole lot of sense to you. So looking for ID that matches the request parameters ID. So this is whatever was sent in over here. Remember those request parameters, so it's going to pass 11 in that case. So we're checking to see the request parameters ID, and then we're returning back the rows as JSON. Let's refresh, And there we go. So that one is working as well. So some of these routes are relatively simple. And again, if you are familiar with SQL, this should be fairly straightforward. The next one, so this one, put. So put is actually an update. So we're going to actually be able to simplify a whole bunch of this because we had to do some workaround because, of course, we weren't using a database and we had to check the variable and so on. So there's quite a bit of extra work that was involved. And in this case, we can just do a run into the database. And instead of insert, we're going to update users. So it's update. And it's not into, so it's update users. So we specify the action we want to take, the table we want to access, and then this is also formatted differently. So this one is going to be set, and then we have to specify name. So it's not values. And I'll just copy that out for now. So equal to, and this is going to be the body name. So this is what we're picking up because we changed the input forms. So all of these are name and all of these are pass. And all we're doing is whenever this gets clicked, then we're going to the parent and we're looking at to find those input values. So we've got the name, and we can comma separate it out. And this one is pass equals to the password. And then we just need to specify where. So where, and ID is equal to, and with this again, we need to specify what we're looking for. And we're looking for request parameters this time because this ID, so this is the value that we're picking up, and this is available within request parameters. So we're not actually passing that. We could just as easily pass it within these inputs as well. And then the function, we're going to grab the error. And this one, the only one that we can probably make use of is status. So we can say status this, and it's not last ID, so it doesn't actually, it's fairly limited. SQLite is fairly limited on what it actually returns. So let's try this out. So save. And we actually don't have to refresh because this is just simply being passed to the route. So let's test, update, and save. So see what happens. So there we go. So that one worked, and we got a status of 1 being returned back. And we can also update our front end as well. We could pass information here that we can utilize to update the various elements on our page as well. So to make it so that we're not relisting all of them. So that's another option to explore for if you want to take up the challenge of updating this front end part of the application. So last but not least is the delete. So the delete is going to be very similar to what we just had with the update. We can get rid of all of that. And instead of update, it's just going to be delete. Delete from users. And we're not setting anything, so we can get rid of all of that. And all we need to do is delete it wherever the ID is equal to whatever the parameter, because we've got the routes again. So the same thing as whenever we see it here, it passes this value into the request parameters, and that's what we're picking up as the ID. And we can keep the same message. So let's try that out. So again, we can really easily get rid of stuff in our database if we want. And there we go. We can more stuff, pass secrets, and save it, and there we go. So everything is working properly, and now we've hooked into the database. So it's a lot more functional, and you'll notice that even if we go to another browser, we enter the same path, we get all of that same information. If we stop out, and we're getting all this null, so those are the errors. We're getting no errors So we're still logging them out into the console. So that's what all of those are. So if we restart our data or our server, then we still have our data there because that's sitting within the database. So go ahead and try this out for yourself, make some updates to the application, and bring the database in, so all the database functionality. And you can try also some creative queries with SQLite. There's a lot of different queries that you can do, and you can extend on the functionality that we've gone through in the previous lessons. So go ahead and try it out for yourself.